Hey everyone, Elia here. This episode is a bit different than your usual ones, and I'm probably going to do more of these going forward. The reason for that is that there are so many topics that I want to explore that I often do in written format, but sometimes I'm unable to do so because of, various reasons. It doesn't quite matter as much. It's usually either because of trauma or my ADHD or both or who knows. And so, for example, if I want to write about what's been happening with the American-Israeli war in Iran, Iran's responses, and sort of the regional and global backlash, it's quite difficult for me to sit down in front of a screen and just write, because my mind is like going at 100 kilometers an hour, whatever the miles version of that is. And it's sort of all over the place. And although I know what I want to say, and I can almost picture it very clearly in my head, the process of transforming that into text, I mean, as many writers, this is not a unique thing, no, is very difficult, and sometimes time constraints don't allow it. So I have to make a decision between, do I want to get that thought out there in one way or another, or do I want to not have it out at all? Hence this recording. I got a new small mic. I'm pacing in my living room now because for very similar reasons, it's very difficult for me to go to where I usually record the podcast, because it will require me to sit down, and I can't quite do that right now because I've been all over the place mentally since the attack on Iran, the killing of Khamenei, and sort of the response by Iran and so on. Most people listening to this, I would assume, know the gist of what's been happening. Around the same time as when you'd listen to this episode, we are releasing a episode of the From the Periphery podcast with Ayman and Isra, in which the three of us talk about what's been happening, focusing on Iran and Lebanon, as those are the two countries that we're most familiar with. I wrote an essay, I don't even know when, a few weeks ago, I think in January it was, entitled How Hezbollah Lost Everything. And shortly after that, I wrote another essay, I'll link both of those in the show notes, called Iranian Protesters Don't Owe Us Anything. In the Hezbollah essay, I said that Hezbollah's tactic, that of co-opting the resistance in Lebanon, which is a long history that I'll try and explain in a bit what I mean by that for those who don't know, but that has led us to a point where effectively there is no resistance left in the country, because it's been monopolized by Hezbollah, often through violent means. And that Lebanon is, as a result, much, much more vulnerable against Israel than arguably we were in the 80s when Israel initially invaded in 1982. I think there's a good case for that, and I might include that in a bit. In the Iran essay, I basically said, the gist of the argument wasn't really on America or Israel, was on the tendency of many so-called anti-imperialists to whitewash, downplay, even excuse at times, and even glorify maybe the authoritarianism of regimes like that of the Ayatollah. And how that not only is immoral and unethical, but that ultimately plays into the hands of your Israel, your America, and so on. And in that essay, which I published I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I said something along the lines of, should the Americans and Israelis attempt a regime change in Iran, no one would have made their job easier than the Iranian state itself. And a few days ago, as everyone knows by now, they did just that. At the very least, whether they will go to for a full regime change, no one actually knows, because as far as we can tell, all the evidence seem to point to the fact that Trump doesn't actually have a plan in mind. He's given different reasons to different reporters that are contradictory and often incoherent, as is his way. Virtually all of America's allies, especially in the Gulf, have been blindsided by this, with the potential exception of the Saudis, who have reportedly lobbied the Americans alongside the Israelis to do this, but we're not entirely sure. As of yesterday, we got new reports that the Americans decided to join an Israeli strike because they knew that the Israelis would do so, and they were predicting that they were expecting basically that Iran would respond, and so they wanted to anticipate that response by joining in on the Israeli effort, which, if you're an American listening, this effectively means that Israel has just contributed to setting the world on fire, and that your country under Trump has effectively done a massive foreign policy move and decision following Israel. So Israel has effectively dictated the foreign policy of the United States, and not the other way around in this specific example. The reason I mentioned that the Iranian state would be partly to blame for a regime change in Iran is that it's very difficult to do regime change in a government, in a country where the government is very popular. It doesn't mean it's impossible, as Chile knows. You can have a popular government and a coup could still happen, but it's gotten more difficult. One thing that has changed since the coup against Allende by the CIA, which of course brought in the dictatorship of Pinochet in Chile, is technology. States like Iran have more tools at their disposal than states like Chile did at the time. So in theory, they could have had more at their, how do I say this? More tools at their disposal to, at the very least, push back against any kind of attempt of regime change. And yet it seemed pretty easy for the Israelis to kill Khamenei. Now again, I'm not saying it would have necessarily made a huge difference had the Iranian state been more popular. I'm just saying that the evidence points, in my opinion, to the fact that the Iranian regime's unpopularity, due to the fact that it has been an extremely violent one, and just very shortly before this war, the regime had just finished massacring, as far as we know, at very least thousands of people for protesting against the Ayatollah. So it's not a surprise that there were Iranians in Iran taking to the streets to celebrate. They're not celebrating Israel or America necessarily, and I would bet whatever you want that most of them don't, but they were celebrating the death of a dictator. It's really that simple, and it's a contradictory feeling. When Assad collapsed, there were lots of people who celebrated, even though the group that led the rebellion against the Assad regime was, to put it very mildly, problematic. Jaish al-Islam. Scratch that, it's not Jaish al-Islam. So the fact that there were people celebrating on the streets does not mean in of itself that they are happy with what's happening. And I mean, very shortly after the attack started on Iran, the Israelis and Americans destroyed and bombed a school where, as far as we know, at the very least 140 something, if not more, schoolgirls were killed. They bombed hospitals in this very Israeli tradition by now. They're bombing medical centers, schools, playgrounds, the usual Israeli playbook. It's still also a fact that the Iranian regime has responded by targeting not just military targets, which they have, which would be one response that is, as far as I know, actually aligned with international law, because there would be this right to self-defense, but they've also targeted civilian infrastructure. Now, you can easily say, well, the Israelis do that all the time, and that is true. It's one of those things where if the response to a war crime is to commit a war crime, not only is that in and of itself a war crime, but it is cheapening the initial war crime. It's no longer about them following the rules of war and us not. It's about neither of us doing so. And so once that happens, usually what tends to happen is that the ones with the bigger guns and the bigger bombs and whatnot win anyway, because there is no argument left that appeals to some kind of abstract of good or international law or human rights or rules of war or whatever. It's who might is right. We're at that stage now. We are at that stage now. The Trump administration very clearly does not know what comes next because they don't seem to have had a plan in the first place. They've used an AI developed by the Claude AI to determine a lot of their targets. And as a side note, I just read a pretty bad piece in The Guardian that describes this new technology, and it honestly just reads like a press release, boasting of the efficacy and efficiency and all of that stuff of those AI tools, and using terms like, and here I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact wording because of course I have ADHD, like faster than thought or something along those lines, which is by definition the same thing as thoughtless. If you're doing something that is faster than thinking, you're not thinking, because thinking does require time, and there is a reason as to why thinking requires time. You need to assess things, pros and cons. If we do this, could it lead to something else, etc., etc. And they have literally admitted, the Americans have, that they don't know who they're killing a lot of the time. And that's, of course, something that the Israelis pioneered in their ongoing genocide in Gaza, especially in the early few months, as Yuval Abraham for 972 brilliantly exposed at the time. And yet, we are where we are right now, not just because we live in a world where there is a Trump and there is a Netanyahu. I fully believe, I fully agree that had there been any kind of accountability against Israel for its genocide in Gaza, we may have not reached, the place we're at now. For one, it may have been the case that Kamala Harris was in power in America and not Trump. I'm not saying she was amazing. I'm just saying it would have been a different ballgame than someone like Trump. And we know now for a fact, and there was a report that was published a few days ago, the Democrats have this group that they set up to, analyze their losses in the elections. And one of the reasons that group concluded lost the Democrats their election is Gaza, because of Joe Biden's complicity in that genocide. So you could easily make that argument, and I would have no problem disagreeing with you on that. And I have no problem also saying, by the way, that this is still primarily America and Israel's fault. It is. They are the ones doing the bombing. They are the ones who started this. It's a very easy argument to make, in my opinion. But I think it's not complete. Because again, had the Iranian state not spent, especially the past few weeks, massacring civilians, well, they would have had a better case to make. More people in Iran might be willing to resist the aggressors, or at the very least go to the streets to support their fallen leader-in-chief or whatever. Instead, many celebrated, many cried, even though this, usually came with confusing sentiments, because you're happy that a dictator is gone, but you're worried, maybe angered even, of how he's gone. You wanted your people to overthrow him. And as far as we know, they may have well done at some point. Protests were getting bigger and bolder. That hasn't changed. And the Ayatollah was getting older and weaker. There is very much a scenario out there that now will never happen, in which it's just the people that overthrow him in one way or another. But I think that's part of what happened, at the very least on the Israeli side. I think people confusing Israeli and American motives are making a mistake. The Israeli side, I think, is much simpler to understand. The Israelis have concluded a long time ago that the very concept, the very idea of accountability is the problem. That is the problem to defeat. When the ICC issued arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant for, among other things, using starvation as a weapon of war, they also issued arrest warrants against Mohammad Deif, one of Hamas's military commanders. The Israelis knew where Deif was all along. That's how they ended up killing him. They could have, very reasonably, staged a kidnapping of the guy and handed him over to the ICC. But they don't do that. For one, Israel does not recognize the ICC. Israel is not part of the ICC. And for two, doing that would of course raise the very obvious question of like, if you're handing this guy over, why aren't you handing your prime minister and that other guy who are also accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity? And obviously the answer would be that we don't want to do that. We don't want our people to be held accountable because that's not good for us. I think there's a through line there that is often missed when at the very least, the stuff I read and whatnot. And by the way, you may hear my dog because my dog is pacing around me. That's how professional this podcast is. I think this is often missed because there's this assumption that geopolitics follows, for the most part, like a very cold, rational logic. And that's not how things often go. The people in power are still people. Many of them are not moral agents. They make decisions for very stupid reasons. We know for a fact now, for example, that there were people that must have been on the inside, at the very least knew that a strike would happen, because they placed a bet on Polymarket. And those were accounts that were set up just moments before they placed those bets, and they made millions of dollars because, of course, that actually happened. They had to know that it would happen. And this could be like a 10% of the reason as to why Trump did it. You know, it's not about long-term anything. It's not about a ideological hatred of whatever. Trump is fine with dictators. He likes dictators. He respects them. The Ayatollah in and of itself is not a problem for someone like Trump. Trump wants to be someone like the Ayatollah. So that hasn't been the reason, you know, or at least not the main one. It could be much shallower than that. We also know, and this came out very shortly after the initial wave of attack, that when the Americans were negotiating with the Iranians in Switzerland, and Oman was the negotiating party, there was a lot of indications that the Americans didn't seem to have actually understood, like just literally did not know what was going on. And that could have, of course, contributed to them making that decision. It could also very easily be the fact that they were having these negotiations just as a way of distracting the Iranians because they were planning on joining the Israelis anyway. We don't know the timeline of this, but this is, you know, roughly what happened. It's not about long-term regime change. Trump maybe would be satisfied with someone like, you know, the Maduro situation, Maduro's vice president coming in and, you know, being subservient to Trump, and Trump being fine with that. It's less of a headache. No, you know, he doesn't have to sacrifice American soldiers that, you know, won't be as unpopular in American politics, etc., etc. So maybe someone comes along in Iran and makes some kind of move, especially towards the Gulf, and saying, you know, if you help me convince Trump to let me be the ruler or whatever, we will stop our attacks on the Gulf, etc., etc. The Gulf right now have as much of a say, if not a greater say, in what Trump is about to do than the Israelis do. Even though the Gulf currently, and we've seen this from at least a number of analysts, including one Saudi analyst who was on Al Jazeera, which remember is Qatari owned, yesterday or 2 days ago, saying that like America has abandoned us and America is more interested in Israel's protection than it is in ours, and we are the ones that host American bases. So there's going to be a lot of repercussions from this. The killing of Khamenei is sort of like the headline-grabbing one. And a lot of Western commentators right now are going to tell you that they are just happy because an oppressor of Iranians is gone. I'm happy that an oppressor of Iranian is gone. But I'm also not, unlike a lot of those people, someone who has spent the past 2+ years whitewashing the Israeli genocide in Gaza. You see where I'm going with this? Hypocrisy, I guess, is where I'm going with this. So Khamenei's death is very significant, obviously. Iran's response is arguably even more significant. And this brings me to Lebanon, the country where, of course, I'm from. And as with these things, if you read The Guardian, which I unfortunately still do, if you read the more right-wing papers, especially in the UK in my case, or to be honest, the American ones, you would be finding it very confusing to even make a distinction between Lebanon, Kuwait, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Jordan, etc., Syria, and so on. It's the crisis in the Middle East, that eternal I forgot these. I forgot. I'm not good at remembering these words. Like the headline on the Guardian. It's not quite a headline. It's like a ticker or something, subtitle, whatever. I'm not sure. It's always there, and then you just fill it with something else. The most recent crisis in the Middle East, and of course, what that does, and I hope this is not, gonna break anyone's brains here, is that it flattens out the complexities in what's actually happening. Lebanon is not Iran. Syria is not Iraq. Syria is not Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not Jordan, etc., etc. So what's happening in Lebanon right now, which is what I wanted to, kind of the second part of this recording, if you want, is frankly terrifying. I haven't been this worried about Lebanon, I think, ever. Except maybe in the immediate aftermath of the Port of Beirut explosion, because we didn't know what the fuck happened. And it was, I'm sure you would agree with me, pretty spectacular and horrible, and horrific and terrifying and so on. But then we did find out that it was actually incompetence on the part of a number of government entities, and so in my mind it's like, well, this is another fucking Lebanese thing that just had a catastrophic impact. It didn't require my brain adjusting in a certain way, and also because I wasn't there, so I don't have this direct trauma. I have it in indirect ways because my friends and family were there. But what happened in Lebanon a few days ago is very different than Iran's response, than even arguably maybe Yemen's response, like the Houthis, although I'm not as knowledgeable of that country, so I won't speak to it too much, or at all actually. This is the extent of it. But what happened in Lebanon is that Hezbollah decided to join the war. And this, many of you may not know this, is an extremely unpopular decision. The government of Lebanon immediately, very shortly after, enacted a law, or whatever the term is, banning Hezbollah's military activities. Hezbollah's erstwhile ally, Amal, agreed with that, so voted for it as well. Hezbollah is very isolated in Lebanon right now. Extremely isolated in Lebanon right now. A good part of why that is the case, and something I think that's missed in pro-Palestine spaces, especially in the West, is that Hezbollah's decision to join Hamas's attack after October 7th, Hezbollah joined October 8th or 9th, I remember, is not the same as Palestinians in Palestine resisting or even committing crimes in the case of October 7th. There is a context there. You can talk about the oppression of Palestinians by the Israelis. You can talk about the decades-long occupation and settler colonialism. You can talk about, what the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé called the slow genocide of Gaza, even that was before October 7th. The blockade, the apartheid, I think I already said that, and so on and so forth, not to mention the many wars that the Israelis have already waged against Gaza. You can name in 1,000 different reasons that wouldn't justify October 7th, but help explain it. And I think that's something that people can do if they want to. Again, not justify. I hate that I even have to say this, but I will anyway, just in case. But, explain it. This isn't the case in Lebanon. That's not the case. Lebanon, of course, does have a history of oppression by the Israelis. But since the year 2000, with the liberation of South Lebanon, which is now, 26 years ago, Lebanon is a sovereign nation, as far as Lebanon's concerned, as far as the Lebanese are concerned. It's not a stateless population, although technically the state of Palestine exists, but as we know, it's basically non-existent in the West Bank. It's basically Bantustans. The PA, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, has very little power, and in fact, most of what they enact is against other Palestinians who are not, shockingly enough, happy with the Israeli occupation. The PA has killed Palestinians essentially on behalf of the Israelis, and so on and so forth. And of course, in Gaza, Hamas with its own politics. That's a different story. That's a different context. Lebanon is not that. Hezbollah has been, up until 2023, 2024, the de facto kingmaker in Lebanon for, I'm going to say, at least a decade plus. A bit longer than that, arguably. Some would argue maybe up 2005 onwards. I would say at the very least since 2012-ish, but it doesn't matter. For a while now. And they've made decisions on behalf of an entire country to join a war against an enemy that most Lebanese are familiar enough with. We know what the Israelis are capable of. We know how violent and monstrous they are, because one of their most notorious doctrines is called the Dahi doctrines. Dahi just means suburb in Arabic, and it refers to Beirut's southern suburbs. We're very familiar with what the Israelis do. We know they bomb hospitals, and that's not even mentioning the fact that, 2014 war, when the Israelis bombed Gaza the first time, not even the first time, the third or fourth or fifth time, at the time the biggest one up until, of course, 2023 onwards, we've seen them bomb hospitals and schools and universities and kindergarten. We've seen them assassinate doctors and journalists and so on. This is not new. It's new maybe for a lot of people, I don't know, in the West or in the rest of the world that, check in on the region when really bad shit happens and things explode. But it's not new for people in Lebanon. Certainly not new for people in southern Lebanon that experienced an 18 years long occupation of Israel by the Israelis. It's not new for anyone in South Lebanon or Dahi or the east of Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, the Be'ah, or indeed a large parts of the rest of the country that experienced 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. We know what the Israelis are capable of. So when Hezbollah decided to join, that was controversial. Hezbollah did not ask the rest of the population. There was no vote on the matter. Hezbollah does not have a majority of power or support in Lebanon. No one does. That's how sectarianism works. Hezbollah's power is through alliances with other sectarian groups. And because we know the Lebanese know what the Israelis are capable of, what was asked is that at the very least, we should have been consulted. Those are our family members, our friends, our homes that will be bombed. But that's the first wave of attacks. It's been 15 plus months since the so-called ceasefire, a ceasefire that, of course, the Israelis have always violated, have bombed, generally it's in the thousands, I don't even have the number in front of me, Lebanon after the quote-unquote ceasefire, to the point where I and other people have argued that what the Israelis mean by ceasefire is you cease and we fire. They've sprayed herbicides throughout large swaths of southern Lebanon as part of their campaign of ecocide. There's urbanicide, in which they've annihilated entire villages, which they continue to do now, especially in southern Lebanon, but also in eastern Lebanon and the Be'ah. Again, we know what they do. And throughout these 15-ish months, Hezbollah did not respond to the Israelis. No, certainly nothing in any significant way. But then the Ayatollah gets killed in Iran, and Hezbollah decides to join. And again, this is very controversial in Lebanon. And right now, I think I can safely say, honestly, I think I can really make the case that Hezbollah is done. It's a done party. It doesn't have a future anymore in Lebanon, certainly not in this format. It may not completely disappear, I don't know, but it's going to be a shadow of itself. And the essay that I mentioned, how Hezbollah lost everything, argues that the reason why it has become, and this was even before the worst bit, I hate it when my essays, especially the depressing ones, turn out to be right. I don't take pride in this. I genuinely hate it. Because Hezbollah did not ask for consent at any stage of their entire history from the rest of the population. And it was one thing during the war and during the occupation of southern Lebanon. No one was being asked, certainly not Lebanese people in the south, whether they want to be militarily occupied. That's not how a military occupation works. You'll be surprised to know, I'm sure. But they had a justification at the time. At least they could say, well, we had no other option. What was their motives for joining after October 2023, and especially now, after the killing of Khamenei? This is why right now things are so dangerous in Lebanon in a way that I don't think, at least not in my lifetime, I remember them ever being. Not like this. I've witnessed a car bomb. I wasn't far from it. I remember the 2006 war. I was 15. Luckily, I wasn't in the areas that were targeted. But Lebanon's very hilly, and my village is in Mount Lebanon, which overlooks Beirut. And I was there on my grandma's balcony, sitting and literally seeing Israeli jets bombing Beirut. I saw it all. Many people in Lebanon obviously did, and many more, not me, many others I mean, experienced it even more directly than I ever had, luckily for me. So I knew. The first thought that crossed my mind, actually, when I woke up and I was told by friends that Hezbollah joined, Hezbollah threw rockets. Actually, rockets were launched, is how it was described at the time. And the first thought that crossed my mind is, and remember, this is coming, like me, I'm someone who, I think I wrote 9 essays on Hezbollah. I've talked about them so many times. This hasn't been my career path of preferred of choice when I was a kid, but that's just how things happened. And that being that I can fairly say I know the group pretty well. I've studied it for a long time. And even by my very low expectations of what they're capable of doing, it took me a minute to believe that it was actually them that did that. And I only believed it when they announced that they are the ones that did that. It was that simple. I guess I was in denial. Despite everything that I already know about the party, even I was confused about them being this reckless, this stupid. Because we know what the Israelis are capable of. They've been bombing the shit out of Lebanon for 2 years now. We know what they were capable of in 2006. We know what they were capable of in the 80s and 90s, even the 70s. We know what they do. We know what their modus operandi is. And after 2006, as I said, they even named one of their most notorious doctrines, military doctrines, after Dahi. That military doctrines, by the way, I realize I didn't actually explain it for those who don't know the Dahi doctrine, states that they will disproportionately target, and here I'm virtually quoting, disproportionately target civilian areas to prevent enemy groups, terrorist groups, however they will call them, from rebuilding capacity. For those who don't know, this is an explicit declaration of violating international law, which has the concept of proportionality in it. You have the right to self-defense if you are under attack, but it has to be proportional. And they just violate international law as a matter of state policy. And people in Lebanon are aware of this. We're familiar with this. We've seen them do this time and time again. So Hezbollah launched the rockets. In 2026, after Nasrallah was killed, after the Israelis have been bombing the shit out of large parts of the country, after there was a mass displacement of at least 1 million people, first time around, 2024, in a country that, for those who don't know, is one of the smallest countries in the world and has roughly 5 to 6 million people in it, after all of that has already happened, they decided to join again. And now the Israelis have, of course, seized on that opportunity. They're forcibly displacing, I don't even have the number in front of me, 50 plus villages, and that was my last update of yesterday. This probably is worse now, almost certainly actually. And very, very likely, because we also know that they have started a quote-unquote limited ground invasion, because everything is limited in time and space until it's not when it comes to the Israelis, very likely they're going to occupy Lebanon indefinitely, as far as we know, in exchange for something else. And maybe they give us back our own lands if we agree to sign on to the Abrahamic Accords, or they force us to sign those anyway, even though they don't want to give us back our land, or whatever it might be. Whatever it might be. And who is winning? What has been, if you jump 10 years in the future, 20 years, 50 years in the future, we look at the history of the Muqawamah, the resistance. Muqawamah, for those who don't know, just means resistance. And in Lebanon, when people say al-Muqawamah, they are literally, explicitly and specifically referring to Hezbollah. The reason for that, and that's a quick aside, but I can link the essay in which I talk about this even more in detail, a number of them, because as I said, I've covered this fucking party for way too long for my own mental health. The reason for that is that, well, a number of reasons, I'll go through them very quickly. When the civil war, the so-called civil war, I call them the Lebanese war, started in 1975, very shortly, within a year, there was something called the Lebanese National Movement. That was like a very wide umbrella of nationalists, leftists, pan-Arabists, etc., allied with the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the chief coalition of Palestinian armed groups, against the dominant at the time right-wing coalition of Christian parties that were effectively representing a good segment of the Lebanese elites. By 1976, so a year into the civil war, and especially by 1977, let's say by 1976, I won't complicate it too much, so a year into the civil war, that coalition, the LNM, the Lebanese and Palestinian coalition, was sort of winning that war. they controlled most of the country because they had a larger percentage of popular approval and just organic support. That's when Hafez al-Assad, the dictator of Syria at the time and father of the one that followed until, of course, his overthrow just over a year ago now, Bashar, Hafez al-Assad intervened in Lebanon with the explicit purpose of crushing the Palestinians. And that came with crushing the Lebanese national movement. The final nail to the coffin, if you want, is in 1977, Hafez al-Assad assassinates the leader of the LNM, Kamal Jumblat. So those groups, those allied with the Palestinians, were of course no friends of Israel. They were ideologically anti-Zionist and so on. And they would have posed a greater risk to the Israelis had they won that war. They were explicitly secular. They had a sort of a left-wing bent that's kind of more complicated because they included nationalists and some conservatives in them, including some Islamists and so on. But they had a program that was at the very least trying to be more inclusive than whatever the alternative provided by the existing dominant class of right-wing Christians were proposing, which was basically more of the status quo and worse of it, is effectively what they were proposing. And that potential enemy of Israel was destroyed by Hafez al-Assad, by the Syrian regime. Now maybe you're starting to understand why I get so pissed at tankies and people who romanticize the so-called axis of resistance and Iran and all of that shit. Because it's just ignorant, insulting, and doesn't do anything really other than piss me off at this point. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That was the first thing that destroyed part of that potential resistance against the Israelis. The second thing that did is the Israelis themselves. In 1982, they invaded southern Lebanon. They besieged Beirut, committed the Sabra Shatila massacre, which was committed actually by the Phalanges, the Lebanese right-wing Christian group, under the supervision of the Israelis that were guarding the camp's entry and exit and not allowing Palestinians to leave, those who wanted to escape the massacre, which lasted 4 days, I think, if my memory serves, a few days. And ultimately exiled the PLO, led at the time by Yasser Arafat. I'm not a fan of him, but that doesn't matter now, to Tunis. So that was the second big blow. Hezbollah wasn't yet in the scene. Hezbollah started, there were like different groups. I think the term in English is Islamic Jihad is the name that was called before them. I'm not entirely sure. Or some version that has jihad in it, I don't remember. Maybe Islamic Jihad Organization, doesn't matter. They're the ones that did the bombs, barrack bombs. Sorry, my English right now is failing me. Against the US troops that were stationed there and killed like 100 something or more than that. I don't remember. It wasn't Hezbollah yet. It didn't really exist yet. Hezbollah came into the scene a few years after. Officially formed in 85, something like that, in the 80s. And Hezbollah, of course, followed the Iranian playbook. Iranian, by which I mean the post-1979, post-theocratic revolution, I would call it maybe a revolution that was followed by counter-revolution, doesn't matter. The thing that removed the Shah and brought in the Ayatollah. The playbook that the Ayatollah deployed against other Iranians after 79 is that those other groups that are not me, especially the communists, will let them be with us and around us while we're fighting the Shah, and then when the Shah is overthrown, we will destroy them. And that is precisely what Iran did. And that's why I described in that aforementioned essay the Iranian playbook that Hezbollah followed through in Lebanon. They didn't just quote-unquote resist the Israelis. In fact, there were periods of the quote-unquote civil war in the 80s where Hezbollah's primary enemy were other Lebanese. They assassinated prominent Marxist intellectuals like Mehdi Amel, and Hassan Roué. They were explicitly ideologically anti-communism and anti-left-wing. So you can maybe start understanding my confusion when there are so many people, at least people who are fed to my feeds by the shitty algorithms on social media that are in the West that call themselves anti-imperialist and that romanticize groups like Hezbollah. And many of those people would call themselves Marxist, ironically enough. And I'm reminded of a scene in a film called Celluloid Underground. It's an Iranian film, actually, and I listed it I mentioned it, I started the Iran essay, I started with that film, where the director is in Tehran, I believe, and he's showing a film called The Cow, which is this Iranian film from the late 60s that was banned by the Shah. The Shah was still in power at the time. And that film is produced and directed and written by Marxists, I don't have the names in mind. Sorry, I'm very bad with names, especially like non-Arabic or Western names. I tend to not remember them as well, so apologies for that. And it was banned by the Shah. And then when the revolution happened in 79, there was a period where they were all not banned yet. Then they were banned. Then other things happened are more complicated. But there was a period where they were banned. And this was before then. So the director was showing a screening of that film. The director of the documentary, who at the time was still a student in Tehran. And after the film concluded, a guy in the audience, who is a pro-Ayatollah, said, "We did not give up our martyrs so that you can show Marxist films." By martyrs and our martyrs, of course, he was referring to those that the Ayatollah approved of. Khomeini at the time. Not Khamenei, the guy that followed. I know, very similar names, annoying as fuck. They both look awful with their beards. For me, they look like Saruman. But it doesn't matter. I'm being distracted because I have ADHD again, guys. For an Iranian that knows this history, it doesn't shock them that a pro-Ayatollah person was anti-Marxist. What's more shocking is other Marxists in the West not knowing that, and in fact romanticizing the Ayatollah as somehow a friend of the left. The same, of course, was experienced by Syrians, and particularly Syrian communists and Syrian Palestinian communists that were assassinated, tortured, exiled, imprisoned, disappeared by the Assad regime. Both Hafez first, who came to power partly, one of the coups d'etats that brought him to power was against the left-wing faction of what was then the Ba'ath Party, and purging them, and then him installing himself in power. How very Stalin of him. Bashar al-Assad pretty much did the same thing, just continued on that proud Assadist tradition, and exiled, killed, tortured, and so on many Syrian communists and many Syrian Palestinian communists. The Syrian regime is the one that was responsible for the assassination of left-wing Lebanese figures, such as Samir Osir and George Howie. Hezbollah is the one that killed Lokman Slim, who was a memory worker whose ancestral origins were actually in Dahiya, and so on and so forth. This is a history that people who know just know that, and it doesn't shock them, or doesn't surprise them rather, maybe it's still shocking but not surprising, when we see the Iranian regime repressing leftists, or when we see the Iranian regime going after and torturing environmentalists, or when we see the Iranian regime sentencing gay people to death for the crime of being gay, or when we see the Iranian regime executing ethnic minorities, like Arabs and Kurds and so on, and of course religious minorities. This doesn't surprise us. It still shocks us because we're humans, but it doesn't surprise people who just know how the regime functions. Because the regime tells us what they do. They have a different messaging maybe if they're trying to persuade very naive online tankies, but when they're talking to their own people, they don't necessarily bother that much. I got angry again, sorry about that. So we know this because they tell us who they are. They show us who they are through their actions and through their words. Nasrallah, as recently as I think it was 2023 or 2022, I think 23 actually, I'm not sure, but like very recently, a year or so before he was killed, reiterated his call that gay people should be killed even if, and here I'm basically quoting, they quote unquote do it only once, as in sex. Because that's the level of sophistication that that person was, and apparently that person was a friend of the left, according to some. So when Hezbollah launched those rockets a few days ago, I was so disoriented because despite everything I just told you, I still assumed naively, wrongly, that they wouldn't just be suicidal. That although, yes, they are a religious, ultra-nationalist or ultra-conservative group aligned with the Ayatollah, itself a hyper-patriarchal, hyper-conservative, etc., dictatorship, and the mullahs and whatnot, and they are part of Wilayat al-Faqih. I always, when I pronounce it between Persian and Arabic, which is very confusing. But still, they have rational actors within them. They know what the Israelis are capable of, because my 13-year-old cousin knows that. So they surely know that, and yet they did it anyway. And now the mood in Lebanon is very, very different, and it's very new, and that's genuinely very scary. I don't mean to plug the class, but just because it's very relevant. But I am giving a class on Lebanon. Registrations are still open. It's going to be Wednesdays and Saturdays in roughly a couple of weeks. I'll put the link in the show notes. And the reason I'm bringing this up because one of the sessions, it's 5 sessions, one of the sessions is about how sectarianism reproduces itself in Lebanon. Sectarianism reproduces, I'm not going to do the entire class now, but one of the ways it reproduces itself is with the people that already have power, threatening for example, civil war. They would say things like Hezbollah has done this, the Lebanese forces have done this. It's not a unique thing, to be honest. Many of them have done this, but they would be like, if we're not careful, we risk a civil war. And of course, the trick there is that's how, a mafia works, is that they were the only ones that could enact such a civil war. And that has always been an empty threat in that sense. Well, not quite so empty, because they did have a mini civil war in 2008 in which Hezbollah actually did militarily take over parts of Beirut and parts of Mount Lebanon. One of the many, many reasons as to why there is legitimate grievance and opposition to Hezbollah that is not just a Western Zionist, Wahhabi, CIA conspiracy or whatever the fuck the latest discourse is on the various social media apps and so on. It's more straightforward than that. We have seen them beat us up. We have seen them kill other Lebanese. In 2019, with the uprising in Lebanon, we took to the streets to demand الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. The people want the downfall of the regime. The regime included Hezbollah. We wanted them gone too. Certainly not in power. Hezbollah and Amal, but especially Hezbollah, is the one that decided to send thugs, sometimes armed, to beat us up, to throw rocks at us, to destroy the tents that were set up by people there. They are the ones, Hezbollah is the one that burned, I think once or twice, this effigy that said Thawra on it, revolution, with like a fist raised in the air. They are the ones that did that, not Israel, not the Saudis, not the Americans. Hezbollah decided to do that. Hezbollah made the decision to intervene militarily in Syria in 2012-2013 on the side of Bashar al-Assad. The Assad regime, who, remember, I just said, intervened in Lebanon militarily in 1976. The other thing I did not have time to say is that the regime had a de facto occupation of the rest of Lebanon from, from the 70s, but until 2005. It's complicated there. And that occupation coexisted with the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon from 1982 to the year 2000. While the Israelis were already occupying the Syrian Golan Heights, which they continue to do so to this day, Hafiz al-Assad, a tradition followed by his son Bashar al-Assad when Hafiz died in the year 2000, and Bashar took over, Hafiz al-Assad, instead of directing his arms against Israel for illegally occupying the Syrian Golan Heights, which are currently still occupied and have been occupied for so long that someone like, I believe it's either Ben Gvir or Smotrich, one of those two, was born, I think Smotrich, was born in the Golan Heights. That's how long it's been since the Israelis have de facto annexed the Syrian Golan Heights, despite the fact that it's against international law, but I think I've established by now that that has never stopped the Israelis. Instead of doing anything about that, they decided to occupy another country, Lebanon. And we've seen them do all of this. When the Assad regime collapsed, you may not know this, and in 2024, among the many people that were released from prisons, of course the overwhelming majority being Syrians, but there were also some Palestinians and there were even some Lebanese. One of them was there in one of the dungeons of the Assad regime's, like its gulags, whatever you want to call them, for like 40 years or something. The Assad regime had told the Lebanese state after 2005 that they had no Lebanese prisoners, that they were holding no Lebanese prisoners in Syria. They were lying. Shocking. I'm saying this because a lot of Lebanese, and this does not require a Zionist whatever conspiracy, a lot of Lebanese just had a direct experience with the Syrian regime. I was among them. I wasn't alive for it, but I remember, my parents remember and my grandparents remember that when my mom was pregnant with me in the late 90s, I was born in mid-1991, our house in the mountains of Lebanon was bombed by Hafiz al-Assad's regime. I have a photo of the ruins and of I think my grandmother's car destroyed, as a way of reminding myself that I'm not losing my fucking mind. When I read these comments and some of these YouTube videos and TikToks and Instagrams, whatever, of like tankies and whatnot, whitewashing and downplaying the Syrian regime. up until, of course, its collapse at the end of 2024. Just to remind myself that I'm not going insane, given that my own home was bombed by them. But anyway, all of this to say that the Lebanese overall are familiar and were familiar with the Assad regime in its long history, 70 onwards until 2024, 50 years or so, 50 plus years, right? Many have experienced direct violence, many have cousins who have been disappeared, tortured, killed by the Syrian regime, and so on and so forth. And so when we heard in 2013, that Hezbollah was militarily intervening in Syria against the Syrian revolution, at the time dominated by the Free Syrian Army, this was of course before the Islamization and the geopolitical, it turning into a civil war and so on, at least in the early days. And maybe as badly or worse, arguably, on the side of the Syrian regime, that same Syrian regime that violated and bombed and brutalized so many people in Lebanon, including Palestinians, by the way. This was a shock for many people in Lebanon. In fact, this was a shock for many people in Syria. I remember this very well. I was 20-something. And yet, they did. And one thing that happened then is that Hezbollah, for the first time in its history, really, maybe arguably since 2008 at least, that was that mini civil war I mentioned where they took up arms against other Lebanese factions, but especially then, I think, had to justify their weapons. Because this has been a big question in Lebanese politics since the 90s, my entire existence. Hezbollah's weapons, highly controversial. I think now, because of Hezbollah's own actions, not so controversial anymore. Hezbollah's main argument, 90s onwards, was that they needed those weapons to resist Israel. This was an easy argument to make in 1990. The civil war in Lebanon officially ended in 91. So between 91 and 2000, when southern Lebanon was liberated, Hezbollah was operating with other Lebanese factions against Israel. And this had broad legitimacy, at least as far as the other Lebanese were concerned, because, well, Lebanese territory was illegally occupied by the Israelis. And their Lebanese proxies, the so-called South Lebanon Army at the time, they bombed a camp, I think, or I don't remember what it was, a building in Qana in 96, I want to say, that killed 100-something people. They were running the Khiyam prison at the border between Israel and Lebanon that notoriously tortured, killed, lots of people. They did a bunch of horrible shit, so it wasn't very difficult for Hezbollah to tell the other Lebanese, we need to keep our weapons because we're the only ones who can fight the Israelis. Now, there was a wink-wink thing, parentheses going on there that I hinted at initially, which was the reason why they could say by then, by the 90s, that we're the only ones who can resist the Israelis, is that the Israelis and Syrians before them, and then after the Israelis, Hezbollah itself, destroyed the rest of the resistance against Israel. And that's how Hezbollah went from becoming a part of al-Muqawamah, the resistance against the Israelis, to al-Muqawamah, the resistance. Other people can join. Other parties can join. Smaller ones can join. It's fine. They don't have hegemony anymore, and they certainly don't have to consult with them. They just take orders from Hezbollah. As long as Hezbollah had the upper hand, they were fine with, quote-unquote, cooperating with others. Because by then they had destroyed most of them anyway. Well, contributed to that destruction. The Syrians and Israelis have done most of the heavy lifting by then. So this was the 90s. 2005, I'm not going to say 2000, it's complicated now. 2006, there was a war between Hezbollah and Israel. And Hezbollah can once again say, hey, listen, they did not win. We are the first Arab group that can, definitely, I think you can argue this, but at the very least say we did not lose against the Israelis. The Jordanians lost, the Egyptians lost, the Syrians lost. All of these other Arabs either lost or decided to be complicit in Israeli crimes. We didn't. We defeated them. Hassan Nasrallah at the time in 2006 described it as a divine victory. Now, military analysts would tell you it was technically a stalemate, but it doesn't matter. The discourse, the narrative was sound. It worked, at least for a while. And so that renewed their permit, if you want, their license rather, for their own weapons. But then came Syria, the Arab Spring in 2011. Syria joins very soon after. At some point, elements of the official Syrian army, which is still unfortunately called by this current government the Syrian Arab Army, despite Syria not being only Arab. That's a rant for another time. A bunch of them defected, and what ended up becoming the Free Syrian Army was formed, the FSA. Then the FSA became something very different later on. I'm just talking about the early days, because that's when Hezbollah decided to join. And they had to now explain to the rest of the population, at least when they bothered to do so, why those weapons that the Lebanese accepted nominally, the Hezbollah would get from Iran. So there's a bit of a security threat there, or national security threat. You might argue that the biggest armed group in the country is getting its weapon and funding and everything else, as Nasrallah himself said, from the Iranians. That's a concern, but hey, at least we see what they actually do with them. They don't turn them on us, they use them against the Israelis. Now, as I've mentioned, they did actually turn it on us in 2008, but many people, I think, chose to not think about that too hard. It doesn't matter. When they decided to do that against Syrians on behalf of the Assad regime, the way Hezbollah justified it was effectively to replicate the war on terror discourse. They called all of those Syrians who were opposing them and opposing the Assad regime takfiris, blasphemers, if I think that's the correct translation, something along those lines, terrorists, and so on and so forth. Barely 10 years after 9/11, almost exactly 10 years after 9/11, you got Hezbollah, which of course is described as a terrorist organization by the Americans, repeating the discourse of George W. Bush. All of those other guys are terrorists. You're either with us or the terrorists, and so on and so forth. Shockingly, maybe it will shock you, I don't know, but like Syrians did not appreciate that. Many Lebanese did not appreciate that, if only not because the Lebanese necessarily give a shit about Syrians. There's a lot of xenophobia and racism and so on in Lebanon. And here I'll quickly reference an essay that I co-wrote with Dara Foyel for Al Jamhuriya in 2019 called Syrian Melancholy in the Lebanese Revolution, in which we both reflected on the Syrians that took part in the 2019 uprising against the government, which, by the way, remember I said included Hezbollah at the time, but were exclusive, like were not including Syrians. Syrians were there, but couldn't be there as Syrians. They had to be basically, invisibilized or whatever, rendered invisible. Why did I mention this? Because when when Hezbollah intervened in Syria, they had to then start answering questions when they bothered to do so, as to why do you have these weapons over there? Why are your men that are armed and trained, why are they in Syria? Those men were supposed to be in Lebanon to help us protect the Lebanese and Lebanese soil and Lebanese land and territory and honor, etc., against those invaders from the south. That's what the entire thing was about. That's the entire point of why you were able to keep those weapons when most of the other parties were forced to dismantle them after the Taif Agreement in 1990, the so-called end of the Civil War. I'm not going to get too much into why I'm saying so-called end of the Civil War, because I actually argue that the Civil War never really ended. In fact, I don't call it the Civil War, I call it the Lebanese Wars. That's something I do get into in the class. So apologies, that was an accidental second plug to that. If you're interested, the links are in the show notes. Doesn't matter now. That was the entire point. We need those weapons because the Lebanese army is too weak. The Lebanese army is compromised. It's funded by the Americans, etc., etc. We need them to fight the Israelis. And here they were fighting the Syrians. Hezbollah even besieged 2 Syrian towns. Hezbollah supporters filmed themselves and took photos of themselves, uploaded them on social media, mocking Syrians that were starving in those towns, and with plates of food, Lebanese, and which is basically Lebanese Syrian Palestinian cuisine, in front of them and them enjoying them. Does that remind you of anything? Of anyone? Of course, that's what the Israelis did in 2014. That's what the Israelis have done since 2023. That's what the Israelis have done for a long time now. Hezbollah did that. Their supporters did that. And that was a decade ago, guys. It's been a decade of that. Hezbollah using its weapons in Syria up until the collapse of the Assad regime on behalf of Iran. A government, a state that is led by the Ayatollah. The Ayatollah has virtually no cultural resonance, organic resonance, popular resonance in Lebanon. Most Lebanese don't give a fuck. So Lebanese only give a fuck about the Ayatollah. It's not like he was a part of our lives. He wasn't. He was part of a specific segment of Hezbollah's base, and that was it, really. Not even everyone that supported Hezbollah followed the Ayatollah's word like it was the word of God himself. And certainly not other Shia groups like Amal, which didn't have that reverence for the Ayatollah in the first place. And certainly not Hezbollah's non-Shia allies, like the Free Patriarch Movement. They didn't give two fucks about the Ayatollah. But this is what happened a few days ago. After all of this, and I didn't even get through all of it, but this is long enough. After everything that's happened, everyone that's paid the price, that sacrificed themselves, that were martyred against the Israelis, after all of this, and after the many years of Hezbollah losing so many men in Syria, which, by the way, another parenthesis, sorry, but this is relevant. One of the reasons why the Israelis were able to hack the Patriots attack, the thing that led to the Patriots attack, one of the reasons why the Israelis had the intelligence that they did, that allowed them to do the thing that they did, is that Hezbollah, by joining what ended up becoming the Syrian civil war on the side of the Assad regime, had to coordinate with the Assad regime, something they didn't really have to do as much before. And the Assad regime, notoriously, was very corrupt. And so Hezbollah basically made their own risk assessment poorer by choosing to join the civil war in Syria, by making Lebanon more vulnerable. Of course, this wasn't the first time they've done that, so why not do it a second time, or third, or fourth, or fifth, depending how you want to count this. And now, a few days ago, they did it again against a much worse enemy than, not for, it was for the Assad regime. In this case, it was against the Israelis, a much worse enemy than even the Assad regime was to most Lebanese in terms of the destruction wrought by the Israelis compared to what the Syrian regime did, which was pretty bad, don't get me wrong, including my own house, as I mentioned a few moments ago. And now Hezbollah, effectively, I think, is on its way out. Again, I don't know whether the party itself would dismantle, maybe not, but it is a shadow of its former self. And it's a shadow of its former self, again, not just because the Israelis are mass murdering lunatics that don't give a shit about international law and commit war crimes left and right all the time and don't follow any norms or whatever. This is a big part of it, but because they've made military decisions from Lebanon that would, of course, implicate all of Lebanon when the Israelis bomb, without consulting with the Lebanese, and after roughly a decade plus of also not consulting with the Lebanese in Syria, making Lebanon more vulnerable as a result of the intervention in Syria, not to mention, of course, the horrors and war crimes committed against Syrians themselves, including committing the crime of starvation as a weapon of warfare, as I mentioned in the early days. But after all of this, after the Israelis already pummeled large parts of Lebanon in 2006, and then again in 2024, even worse so than 2006, for those who don't know, like scale-wise and destruction-wise and so on, Hezbollah decides in 2026, after 15 or so months of so-called ceasefire that the Israelis violated every single day multiple times by bombing Lebanon, Hezbollah had very little to no response to that. Then the Iranian guy in his 80s, who already had cancer and who had declared like a preference for martyrdom before being killed himself, gets killed by the Israelis, and Hezbollah decides within a day or two to join the war after everything that's happened. And now, as I'm recording this, barely an hour ago or 2 hours ago, the Israelis are back in southern Lebanon. They already had posts there, don't get me wrong, in the past couple of years. Now they're even further, they're deeper into Lebanon. The Lebanese army has withdrawn from those positions. Hezbollah is nowhere to be seen. And what is happening, I haven't checked the news in like an hour now, so it's probably happened even as I'm recording this, is that large parts of the country are being bombed. The risks of a civil war, especially between Hezbollah and all of its opponents, which are many in Lebanon, is higher than it's ever been. And it is part of the reason why it's higher than it's ever been is this resentment that's been built against the party for so long now. That the party, by the way, is Hezbollah, because Hezb in Arabic just means party. Hezbollah means the party of God. That's their name in Arabic. That Hezbollah did not give two fucks about in terms of having some kind of popular buy-in for their activities in Syria or against the Israelis. And this is where we're at now. It used to be in the 70s, even early 80s, if one wants to be generous, that there was some kind of potential for a wide coalition of various groups, nationalists, leftists, pro-Palestine people and whatnot, to come to power after a year or two of civil war. The action of the Syrian regime prolonged that war. In 1982, the invasion of Israel prolonged that war even more and made it much worse. And then the advent of Hezbollah killed off the rest, whatever was left of the initial resistance that was at the very least progressive oriented, and then became the dominant group. And I'm not going to even get too much into details of how that happened. Or maybe I am, why not? You may have stopped listening by now, this is long enough, I understand. But these are details that are just not often mentioned, and by often I mean almost never. In the late 80s, for a period of, I think, a few months, I'm very bad with dates, Hezbollah and Amal, those two Shia parties, declared war on one another. And this is a war that now they have since called Harb al-Ikhwa, the War of the Brothers. Of course, at the time when they were killing each other, they did not call it that. Hezbollah basically won. Hezbollah was backed by the Iranians. Amal was backed by Hafez al-Assad. And so the compromise that they found, which is something we saw especially developed in the 90s, is that Amal would do government stuff. That's how Nabih Berri, the leader of Amal, has been Speaker of Parliament in Lebanon since 1992, I believe, and I was born in 91, so basically my entire life since then. And Hezbollah would do resistance stuff, military stuff. This was a compromise that was then in the 90s imposed by the Syrians under the so-called Pax Syriana. Remember, I said that southern Lebanon was occupied by Israel between 82 and 2000, and the rest of Lebanon was de facto occupied, and there was a military presence, Syrian military presence, by Syria up until 2005. Sorry for the accidental third plugin, but in the class I do expand as to why 2005 is a important year. So again, link in the show note if that interests you. And we're here now. This is where we're at now. The resistance, historical resistance is gone. There is no group that can remotely rival what Hezbollah has built over the years in terms of power, even now in its weakened state. It's very unclear what their capabilities are, but it's not nothing. They, a few hours ago, also launched rockets towards Israel, is my last update. They may have done so as I'm recording this, I don't know. And which means that Israel has carte blanche. The only thing limiting Israel right now is the Americans, and we know how much they love limiting Israel, right? Maybe the Gulf, if they give a shit about Lebanon, which I don't think they do. Maybe the West, if they give a shit about Lebanon, although I don't think they do. And really, like, this is how cynical I may seem right now, but I don't think, unfortunately, I think this is accurate, that the only thing that may save Lebanon is if at some point the West especially is paranoid that there will be a mass influx of Lebanese refugees leaving Lebanon and trying to make to Cyprus, which isn't that far away. It's so close, relatively speaking, that when there was the Port of Beirut explosion in the year 2020, 4th of August 2020, there were parts of Cyprus that actually felt it. That's how close Cyprus is. And Cyprus is in the EU. The EU, for those who don't know, I think most people do know, has had a horrific policy of allowing migrants and asylum seekers to drown. In fact, the number, I believe the latest report I saw is that you have 700, it's in the hundreds, people that have drowned to death in the first 2 months of this year alone. And so if the European Union is then worried about a huge scale, a mass scale of Lebanese refugees coming to its shores, maybe then it intervenes in one way or another and gives a bunch of money to the Lebanese government and says, you keep those guys over there and we'll give you some money to effectively turn the entire country, or parts of it anyway, into a concentration camp, a prison camp. That's what they've done with Libya, that's what they've done, or the deals that they've had with the Egyptians and with Tunisia and so on and so forth. They've also done, I wrote an article for Al Jazeera a few years ago, 2 years ago, when the EU decided to give, I think, €1 billion to the Lebanese state, and part of the reason for that was that the Lebanese state could manage basically the Syrian refugees in Lebanon. That's what they mostly care about. That's a de facto white supremacist policy. I will rant about this another time. But up until then, I don't foresee necessarily the West or the Gulf or whatnot lifting a finger, because they all want Hezbollah gone anyway. And as long as they assess that the main, the pros outweigh the cons, so to speak, by pros meaning Hezbollah gone, cons being most of Lebanon is destroyed as well, but they may not give a shit about that for the reasons I already mentioned, they may be fine with it. They're developing all of these AI technologies that the Americans and Israelis are pioneering. The Europeans want to get a hand on those, and so on and so forth. And this is sort of the world we're entering, which I think you would all agree is a much more dangerous one than before the Gaza genocide. Because this is where it all goes back to. I mean, it can go further back if you want, but this is especially the most recent versions of things, the most recent iteration of history, if you want, starts then and there. And this is where we're at now. Sorry, I said this a few times. Friday's Times listeners, you may be more used to me having a hopeful note in the end. I admit I struggle to have one now, although I do have one that is sort of optimistic, or hopeful rather, not optimistic, but has hope embedded in it. Which is that if you think about Israel, they don't seem to have a long-term strategy beyond when someone like Netanyahu panders to the far-right messianic Zionists that say that they want, quote-unquote, biblical Israel, which includes Egypt, parts of Syria, parts of Jordan, parts of Lebanon, obviously all of Palestine. Did I say Syria? Part of Syria, and so on. The Levant plus Egypt. I've even seen some maps that include parts of Iraq and so on. And more territory, more land to colonize, and so on. But one mistake that Netanyahu did, in terms of let's say, I don't know if there's a word I can't quite think about it on the spot. But in terms of if you were thinking in terms of Israel's long-term survivability or whatever, there's one thing that you shouldn't do, and that's something that Israeli politicians, including Netanyahu, I should say, understood up until Trump 2.0, which is that as far as Americans are concerned, you try and appeal to both Democrats and Republicans. Netanyahu abandoned that with Trump 2.0. He was very happy when Biden was willing to send all of those weapons and protect the Israelis, and Biden attacked and sanctioned the International Criminal Court before Trump obviously did it even more and worse. They were very happy, of course, Netanyahu was very happy that Biden was willing to give all of that and do all of that for Israel's quote-unquote security, while accelerating and de facto supporting the genocide in Gaza. Something that I think many Democrats don't want to think about too much now, but that is still a fact. I wrote an essay on the first article I wrote on the newsletter, Ontologies, was, I think, called the Democrats have an Israel problem, at a time when there was the DNC, when it was still Harris versus Trump. Anyway, I digress. But a big mistake that Netanyahu has done since is put all of his eggs in the Trump basket. For the first time in history, or at least in a long time, as far as I know, Americans overall are more sympathetic they sympathize more with Palestinians than they do with Israelis. This was unheard of not that long ago. You got centrist Democrats, hardly radical leftists, whatever, who are saying it seems obvious that the reason we're bombing Iran and exposing all of our troops in the Gulf and so on, and obviously disrupting large parts of the global economy and so on and so forth, is because Israel was planning to attack Iran and Trump decided to join in. So effectively, as I mentioned initially, the Israelis have dictated, at the very least, this segment of US foreign policy. I'm saying this because I know that a lot of people, unfortunately, would have then the tendency which go more into conspiracy theories of saying, well, there is a global whatever lobby that controls everything. And this has a lot of anti-Semitic undertone, more like overtones, that I want to make sure and make very clear that is not what I'm saying, because that would be fucking stupid. That's not what I'm saying. Israel has a lobby, so do the Saudis. The NRA is a lobby. So many lobbies in America because America is corrupt as fuck. What distinguishes them is their ability for so long, I'm thinking of AIPAC and all of the others, in the US and political arena to be both pro-Democrat and pro-Republican and basically not giving a shit who they were supporting as long as the person that they were supporting was unconditionally pro-Israel. They would give them a rating, much like the NRA does, of like how pro-Israel are you, giving them incentives, and by incentives I mean a lot of money to support their candidacy and so on. And so they would have a bunch of people. They would have helped a bunch of members of Congress and so on get in power and be elected. And that helped this hegemony of a pro-Israel consensus in Washington, D.C. for decades and decades and decades. That is gone now. That is gone now. And it is gone because Netanyahu did not think clearly and thoroughly about the future of Israel, because all he gives a shit about is him remaining in power for as long as possible. Shockingly, I know. I mean, it will shock a lot of listeners, I'm sure. And so he's put all of his eggs in the Trump basket. Trump, many people, listeners, would know this by now, is very unpopular, including in the US. His approval ratings are down the drains. Is that the expression? Whenever I attempt expressions, my brain breaks because it makes no sense to me. My autistic brain doesn't know what the fuck's happening. So it's from memory and I get it wrong all the time. And so now there's the midterms coming. Trump, the Republicans are very likely to lose a lot to the Democrats. Democrats whose base includes people in New York, for example, who voted for Mamdani, who has a lot of like Mamdani-like people rising in the ranks of the Democratic Party and to propose something akin to democratic socialism and so on. And overwhelmingly, the consensus is becoming, especially among Democrats, but honestly increasingly among some Republicans as well, and many more Republicans, that like Israel hasn't been very good for America, whether for human rights reasons or even for like national security, selfish reasons. If the only thing you give a shit about is like American supremacy in America and is that the word, unipolar world or whatever, it's very hard to conclude that Israel has been good for that, because now we're de facto into multipolar world. And a big reason for that is that the unconditional support and protection of Israel has created a lot of enemies that the Americans did not really have to create. And a lot of resentment, as the aforementioned Saudi analyst who was on Al Jazeera mentioned yesterday or 2 days ago. And so the Israeli side, that when you talk about Israeli politics, and I will end on this note before actually talking about the class, the Israeli side, including the so-called opposition, with very, very small, very few exceptions, is in line with the visions of expanding as long as possible, of treating the rest of the region as de facto hostile, of seeking to destroy as much as they can when they can, of creating new facts on the ground, of destroying. They're in favor of that, and they're on record saying that. Naftali Bennett, who was the Prime Minister of Israel and now technically part of the opposition, again, opposition in quotation there, was quoted just a few days ago saying that Turkey is the next Iran. They haven't even finished with Iran, and they're already setting their eyes on Turkey, which is a member of NATO, by the way. So count that as yet another example of how NATO is going to be demolished, not because of Russia, ironically, but because of America, Israel, and others. Shit, not good, guys, but the hope that is embedded in what I just said is that because the Israelis don't have a long-term strategy, and because Israel's existing strategy, a strategy that they cannot just replace with something else, has been to basically depend on America's unconditional or quasi-unconditional support and weapons and funding the Iron Dome, funding that and so on. Once the Republicans lose power, which they absolutely will at this point, the Israelis are in trouble. Not because the Democrats that will follow are, again, quote-unquote radical leftists or whatever, but because a lot of them who only give a shit about being elected and satisfying their base and whatnot, it's not that complicated for them to look up the polls and to do surveys and whatnot and judge the mood of the country, of their base, of the people that they're trying to convince to elect them and so on. See that if they have a very pro-Israel platform, and in fact at times any kind of association with the Israelis, they risk becoming unpopular, losing their seat, and maybe not getting elected at all in the first place. And that's bad news for Israel. Israel, which probably would not even be able to rely on its Gulf allies by then, who knows? The Gulf allies that now have a very real taste of consequences, rather of like Iran lashing out against them to punish the Americans, because that's the reason why Iran is targeting Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Bahrain. I believe as of now, Oman is the only one that the Iranians have not targeted. I could be wrong, but I think so. Those Gulf states, very rich petro-dictatorships run by absolute monarchies that host US bases, couldn't be protected by the Iranians because they, as again that Saudi analyst mentioned, concluded and are seeing rather that the Americans under Trump and the Pete Hegseth and Mike Huckabee and the Christian Zionists of the Trump administration, only thing they give a shit about is Israel. And that's not very good for long-term building. It's going to be very difficult after all of this is done for states to believe that the best path forward for their own security is relying on the Americans. Because I think the Americans have, this isn't the first time, but I think this has become maybe the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, if that is the correct expression, probably, have proven that they are not reliable. They are just not reliable. And so here we are. It's not good for American supremacy. It's not good for Israel's ethno-supremacist settler colonial project of a state in the long term. And probably I think almost certainly that's a good thing. It's going to come with a lot of bad things whenever you have empires collapsing and so on. But it is a good thing that supremacy, that imperialist state, the Americans and so on, are being exposed for what they are. A lot of people, in any case, will start seeing it that way, and before they may have not. And the reason why the popularity of Palestinians, or at least like sympathy towards Palestinians, has risen in America is because people have access to phones and have seen what the Israelis are capable of doing in the in Gaza, and have now, since Trump 2.0 came to power, have now associated Netanyahu especially, but in many cases Israel more broadly, with the Trump administration, and do not understand why, when there's inflation and a housing crisis and one of the worst healthcares in the world and so on and so forth, why so much money is being sent to Israel. Money that is being spent, is being used, to bomb and annihilate entire populations, commit genocide, in Gaza, commit ecocide in Lebanon, commit a version of genocide, especially including, ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, continuing apartheid, and so on and so forth. And now, obviously, having even a regional war with Iran, killing the leader of Iran, and causing this global chaos. It's going to be very difficult for a lot of even allies of Israel or erstwhile allies of Israel to just trust them from now on. I would, of course, argue, and I think listeners would agree, that they should have stopped trusting them a long time ago, but here we are. This is where it is. Warnings were ignored. Warnings by random people like myself and other people who are even higher up in the halls of power and whatever have been warning about this for a long time. It does not take rocket science to have seen this coming, and yet it came anyway. So, I'm going to stop now. I think there is hope there, because if the authoritarians in power are not planning long term, there is a window of opportunity there for people like us who don't really like them to start planning long term. This is the purpose of episodes like this one, to, despite all of the difficulties and horrors and whatnot, to always try as much as I can emphasize that people who believe they have absolute power and therefore are corrupted absolutely, to use that aphorism from like 200 years ago, 300 years ago, whatever, or maybe not that, doesn't matter, maybe older than that, but it doesn't matter, they're not very good at long-term thinking. And because they're not very good at long-term thinking, they can be like a Trump threatening to invade Canada, and within virtually overnight, the Conservatives of Canada, which were the favorites to win the Canadian elections, are defeated by the Liberals, which I'm not a huge fan of. I am still, though, glad that it's not the Conservatives. Those are things that authoritarians are not, historically, have not been very good at planning. The 1,000-year Reich has lasted, 11 years, 12 years? Very, very insufficient. And I think it's the same with Trump, with Israel, with far-right governments from Putin to Modi to Orban to so on and so forth. I've mentioned this a few times. The problem or the fear, this is an essay, something I mentioned, and I will actually end after this and talk about the class. An essay I wrote for Shadow Mag on reform called Inside Reform's Plan for a Fascist Takeover, which I published a month or so ago, in which I said like one of the things about fascism that maybe is, I'm sort of paraphrasing myself here, that's often misunderstood, is not just, rather, that fascism cannot be defeated or that fascism is eternal. Of course it's not. And fascism is not eternal. Nothing ever is. Nothing is permanent. Everything has a end date, an expiry date. The problem is the damage that is done in the meantime. So yes, the Nazis did not last 1,000 years, and that's a good thing. But in the years that they did last, they committed multiple genocides, including, of course, the Holocaust. They destroyed large swaths of Europe and, in fact, the world as well. That's the problem with fascism. That's the problem with the Americans, what they're doing right now. That's the problem with European cowardice and cynicism, what they're doing right now. That's the problem with Israeli expansionism and aggression, what they're doing right now. That's also the problem with the Ayatollah's regime up until now. That so much suffering of, for the most part, ordinary civilians is caused in the name of something, and that something collapses. And it's the rest of the human population, those that are not at the heads of governments and whatnot, that have to deal with the trauma. The hope in doing these episodes is that I'm able to, with difficulty, and this was certainly one of the more difficult ones, I think, emphasize this specific point. Things are not permanent. The people in power do not have omnipotence. They don't plan 100 years ahead of time. They are fallible. They are mortals. Some of them, like Trump, is almost 80 years old. They will be gone one day. I'm not saying this to say, like, sit back and just wait for it to happen. Of course not. But it is important for us to remember that. So at the very least, what we can do is disarm this part of fascism and authoritarianism more broadly, is for you to be afraid and for you to believe that there is no alternative possible. And part of the reason I'm doing this is to say that that is just factually wrong, and we need to remind ourselves of that. Only then can we start thinking about how to build something better and a better alternative in a better world and so on. Okay, this was the end of that very long monologue. If you don't care about the class, you can stop listening now. No worries, I won't take any offense. Last thing I'll say is if you want to support my work, the best way you can do so is on Ko-fi. I will put the link in the show notes. You can choose a one-off amount or a monthly donation. Any amount is appreciated. A suggested one would be £5, whatever the equivalent of the NUSD is. But of course, if that's not something you can afford, that is completely fine. If you can afford much more than that, I will not say no. You'll be surprised. And if you cannot afford it at all, that's also completely fine. One way you can help, as always, is to share this with your friends. The Fire These Times is part of the From the Periphery Media Collective, and one way to support the FTP Media Collective is to go on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery with, I forgot what the amount is, I think $5. And by doing that, you will support not just this podcast, but all of the other podcasts that we do, including the Impossible Revolution podcast, the Mutual Aid podcast, Politically Depressed, Khida, and many more to come, hopefully, in the future. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And now I'm going to talk about the class. So I'm giving this class. It's going to be the second time I do so. It's an online class. It happens on a weekly basis. There's 5 sessions. There is the Wednesday session and the Saturday session. I've already done this once, and it was only on Saturdays, and some people requested a Wednesday one as well. So I'm opening that up as well. In which I talk about Lebanon, a recent overview, like a recent history, if you want, of Lebanon, an overview of roughly a bit kind of the time period I covered when I spoke about, maybe rather ranted about Lebanon in this episode, roughly 75 onwards, with a focus on the 1990s specifically onward. the so-called post-war. I will talk about why do I say post-war, why do I say so-called post-war, what is it about Lebanese sectarianism that makes it both unique and also not so unique? Why should we stop thinking really about sectarianism as a static thing that is just there because of whatever reasons, but as a process, and why, for example, a term like sectarianization is more useful? I'll be talking about how Lebanese elites have maintained their power over so many people for so long, despite sectarianism as a system itself being very inefficient, corrupt, and deeply unpopular. And how have, which is unfortunately very topical now, how have regional dynamics contributed to the survival of the sectarian state in Lebanon, and why that is something that many people, especially if you identify as an internationalist and you're interested in global justice and peace and so on, I think is something that needs to be understood. The title of the course is Beware of Small State, which is a pretty good book and one of the books that I recommend. Lebanon since 1975 is the other bit of the title of the course. And that's what you'll be getting. It's a messy course in the sense that it's informal. It's a bit like the podcast when I have a guest on or guests on. People can participate all the time. The syllabus is the same as the previous class, and it's structured and organized, but it's also fluid. Classes last for 2 hours, and this has already happened every single time with the previous class, we can go longer than that. There are 4 sessions. The first 4 sessions have a something concrete I want to explore and explain. And then which roughly lasts about an hour or so. Think of it as like a lecture or a presentation or whatever. And then after that, there's like a small break, and then it's more of the lecture, but also Q&A and talking about things. And as I said, it can go beyond 2 hours, focused on Lebanon and the region. But if I'm able to answer questions about other topics that I'm knowledgeable about, I of course will. And usually I'll try and find a link between what we've already been talking about and that other topic. For example, in the first class, we talked about Minnesota, and so on and so forth. As I said, it will be Saturdays and Wednesdays and or Saturdays. You can choose to attend the Wednesday or the Saturday, or if you're crazy enough, you can attend both, even though I'll be repeating myself on the Wednesday, actually, because the Saturday starts before the Wednesday. The cost is 220 pounds, which is, I think, roughly 300 USDs. I wish it could be cheaper than that. In fact, from what I know, it's actually cheaper than some of the other classes of a similar nature that I've seen. But I would have liked it to be much cheaper than that, and in fact free. But we still live in capitalism, and I need to survive, etc., etc. So I hope that's understood. And if you can afford it, if that's something that interests you, you can even sponsor someone else to attend. That's what happened the first time around. You can attend alongside that person, or that person can attend and you don't, whatever you want. There are still some spots left for both Wednesdays and Saturdays. I haven't checked the latest. I think it's 5 spots for the Wednesday, and I think it's, or vice versa, I don't remember, and 6 spots for the Saturday. So if you're interested, please head out to thefarEastTimes.com/Lebanon class. The link will be in the show note. All of the descriptions are there. All of the instructions are there to for you to know what to do and how to book and whatnot. In short, it's very simple. There is a Ko-fi link. You pay there, and then you send me an email or you send me a signal message. Email is ayoub@thefarEastTimes.com. Signal is ayoub.02, so last name .02 only. And you let me know that you are that person that just paid on Ko-fi. This is just for me to organize my document, which is private, don't worry, and for me to know like who's joining, and so I can send you the Zoom link and whatnot. Anyone who joins will have access to a Google Drive that is constantly being updated and continues to grow. That includes, besides of course the class-related stuff and the texts that are suggested readings but not required, and the episodes, the podcast episodes, and so on, but also selected films, Lebanese films that I talk about in the class, because my PhD is on the history of post-war Lebanese cinema specifically, so I have a lot to talk about it. What else? Books, a lot of PDFs of books that are not necessarily available online that I'm using Lebanon, or if not on Lebanon, but maybe like related thematically or whatnot in the class, that I will put up there. It would be a private link for students only. And anyone who joins any class will have de facto discount on any future classes that you also want to join. If you're taking the same class again, it's like 80% off. And honestly, I would be fine if you don't pay at all. That would be fine. It's just a suggested 80% off to help with the cost. And for other classes that are not on Lebanon, like other classes that I'm planning to develop and do at some point, you'll have it, I think 30% off is the price, is the percentage I set. You can see what those other classes are. There's one on anti-imperialism and how to do anti-imperialism without being authoritarian basically. It's called Amitai, which is a term I'm starting to coin, I think, against multipolar imperialism, and what's the T? Towards anti-authoritarian internationalism. That's very long, so let's just say Amitai. There's going to be also a class on James Baldwin, whose book, The Fire Next Time, inspired the title of this podcast. There's going to be a class on Lebanese cinema specifically, which might be like on a monthly basis, more like a cinema club, we'll see. And other stuff that I'm also planning to work on. If you have requests, things that you would like to know more about that you think I have something to say about because I've talked about it on the podcast or whatever, please feel free to reach out. You can be as informal as you like. Just introduce yourself, please, because otherwise I may suspect spam and whatnot. You can message me on Signal at ayoub, so just ayoub.02, or as I said by email, ayoub@thefridaystimes.com. I do answer to everything. I may take a while to do. If it's too long, feel free to message me again, don't worry, and so on and so forth, okay? So the class starts soon. I'm very excited about it. I got very good feedback from the first one, and I've learned from the shortcomings of the first one as well, so the second one should be better. And I'm opening up to more people now because there was quite a lot of interest, which is always nice to see. Lebanon is a complicated place, but not an unknowable place. It can actually be understood. That's going to be the main thing I argue and I show and I prove, and I hope you'll all join me. All of the details will be in the show notes. Thank you for listening, everyone, and take care.